Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our viewers from all over the world. Thank you for joining us today. And on behalf of the Center for International Law at NUS, thank you for attending our panel discussion today on One Health and international law. One Health recognizes that human, animal, and environmental health are interlinked, and it calls for interdisciplinary integration and cross-sectoral cooperation. One Health covers matters such as the prevention of zoonotic diseases, antimicrobial resistance, and food security. The COVID-19 pandemic has displayed the critical importance of a One Health approach, yet the approach remains largely underdeveloped in prevailing international legal frameworks. The purpose of today's panel is to discuss the concept of One Health, its status under prevailing international law and governance, and to address detailed reforms such as the possibility of including a One Health approach in a future pandemic treaty. Today, we have with us the following distinguished panelists. Professor Gianluca Berci, Adjunct Professor of International Law at the Graduate Institute of Geneva, Academic Advisor at the Global Health Center, and Visiting Professor and Senior Scholar at the O'Neill Center on National and Global Health Law. Ms. Helene de Puta, Lecturer in Public Law specializing in International Health Law at the University of Franche-Comté. Dr. Pedro Villarreal, Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. Ms. Danielle Liao, Adjunct Senior Research Fellow, Center for International Law at NUS. And our moderator for today's panel will be Professor Ayelet Berman, lead of the Global Health Law and Governance Program at the Center for International Law at NUS. Professor Ayelet, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, yours. Thank you. Welcome everyone from wherever you are around the globe. Thank you to our panelists who have agreed to come and discuss this topic with us today. I'm very much looking forward. As Shir mentioned, I lead the work on global health law and governance at the Center for International Law. And One Health is really one of these topics that have been kind of gaining ground in recent years. One could say that in scientific or public health, global health circles, this is not a new topic and has been being discussed widely. But now, especially after the pandemic, there is really an increased awareness to this topic also within the international law circles and law more generally. So really the purpose of this panel today is, first of all, for us to kind of understand what this term One Health is all about. I mean, in its essence, as Shirs has mentioned, it's really about this interface between human, animal, and environmental health and how they're all interlinked and influenced, but how is it really perceived? How is it defined? And so forth. And then to try to understand how, if at all, it's integrated currently within international legal frameworks and some national or regional legal frameworks, and thinking about the future, especially after the experience we've now had with COVID-19 and this understanding that pandemics are here to stay. How should the concept of One Health be integrated into our international legal frameworks, and perhaps also within a pandemic treaty that is now currently under discussion? So really against this background, I'm really so happy to have our four excellent speakers here, whose Shir has already introduced, but you're all experts in your fields in environmental law, global health law, international law. So I think we have a great group of people here to discuss this topic. I will also mention that all of our panelists are members of the International Law Association Steering Committee on One Health, and we're working together on developing a white paper on this topic of One Health and international law. So it's really something kind of in the making. So without further ado, I'd actually like to, and I'll just also mention again what was said before regarding questions. Please, audience at home, if you do have questions, there is a question and answer kind of function below, and we'll try to address these questions towards the end of our session. So without further ado, I'd really like to first of all turn to you, Pedro Villarreal, who's been working on this issue for some quite while. Could you first explain to us, I mean, One Health is such a vague term, and could it mean so much? What do we actually understand with the concept of One Health? When did it appear? What are kind of its main aspects? If you could just really take us first into these very basic understandings of the notion of One Health, which I think is really new to most lawyers.
Yes, very gladly. Thanks so much, Ayelet, and thanks everyone at the Center for International Law of the National University of Singapore. And it's a pleasure to be here today. And indeed, I fully agree with Ayelet. So the current pandemic has shown in tragic fashion how human health is ultimately interlinked to with animal, in this case, non-human animal health and the environment. And the concept of One Health, well, indeed, in the legal field, it's still under development and still not fully clear what type of legal features this concept will have in terms of, for instance, under international law, what obligations should states have on the basis of One Health concept. But in the, let's say, in its epistemic roots, it's actually not it's not a new concept. It's a relatively well-established concept that emerged in veterinary medicine, particularly mainly due to the realization, as I mentioned, that human and non-human animal health are inseparable. And this is particularly the case in infectious disease control, as we have seen in the most recent studies that of the beginning of this pandemic, the most or the likeliest origin of this pandemic was a zoonotic event, a zoonotic spillover, where a non-human animal was carrying the SARS-CoV-2 virus and then transmitted it to a human. And this again shows how at the microbiological level, the interspecies barrier is ultimately artificial. And the One Health concept was devised as a matter of trying to overcome this silo thinking, where we separate artificially, of course, at the microbiological level, we separate the way in which we face human health from our concerns with non-human animal health and the environment, because ultimately all these interactions between humans and non-human animals occur against the backdrop of an environmental setting where the more we encroach upon the environment, the more we enter into contact, of course, with these diseases that are currently or previously had not been circulating amongst humans, as COVID-19 was. So its main aspects, again, it's not being at the epistemic level a new concept. When it gained traction at the interinstitutional level was in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s, first decade of the century, when on the one hand, wildlife conservationists started to promote this concept as a way in which we could also strengthen our protection of non-human animals, endangered species, and the environment, and moreover led to an interinstitutional collaboration between the World Health Organization, the World Animal Health Organization, or Organización Internacional de Epizooties, and other institutions like the World Bank, UNICEF, and this led to at that moment cooperation that was not as formalized, and this will be, I guess, what we will further discuss today. It was a partnership based on an agreement and memorandum of understanding to collaborate, but it didn't really turn into a more permanent and more institutionalized initiative until recently, that is. And this burgeoning, at least in 2007, was a burgeoning interinstitutional collaboration, also highlighted how the fragmentation of international law has led to these silos where different areas of law are addressed often in parallel from each other. So I do believe the One Health concept could be a way in which we can, at least these international organizations and other stakeholders can join forces beyond their usual areas of action. But of course, this requires a change of mindset insofar as we tend to be very specialized and very focused on specific regimes. So One Health, in my view, tries to overcome this silo thinking approach. And we will see whether in the upcoming months or years, this One Health concept will turn into something more formalized, more institutionalized, and even from a legal perspective, to a more concrete obligations for states. Thank you for this question, Ayelet.
Thank you, Pedro. So you really highlight something really very interesting. So even though this epistemic concept has existed for many years, and now we see this institutional collaboration rising around this, it really is a big question. Will they be able to actually overcome their own silos? Like, it's nice in theory, but in practice, will this ever really be able to work out, to bridge these different fragmentations? And indeed, when you see all these different initiatives in the field of One Health, you do ask yourself that question. And that actually brings me to Gianluca, whom I wanted to ask again. I mean, coming from this, One Health is now increasingly talked about as a really critical element of pandemic prevention, right? That's now what we're all concerned about. How do we prevent pandemics? How do you see why is it so important really in pandemic prevention? And how do you see this role of One Health going forward in terms of pandemic prevention?
Thank you, Ayelet, and thanks also from my part for inviting me, and congratulations for your center, the University of Singapore, that has been very, very active in these last couple of years, with many interesting initiatives. You use these social media quite effectively, so congratulations. Well, as Pedro said, we do have a problem, because if you look at the most important outbreaks or diseases in the last decades, most of them are of zoonotic origins. Most of them come from animals, starting with influenza, seasonal and pandemic, but also HIV/AIDS. Very likely it came from primates, from monkeys in Africa. COVID, SARS, MERS, Ebola, other hemorrhagic fevers. Most of these diseases come from animal species, in particular wildlife, and most of them are of viral origin. So we do have a problem. We do have a blind spot in global health security that derives in good part from the fragmentation and the silo thinking that Pedro was talking about, but we also have a blind spot in international law from a regulatory perspective, both at national level and international level. Also, I mean, if we need a confirmation, COVID shows that these diseases, in particular respiratory diseases, once they jump into the human population, they're very difficult to control, given the mobility of population at the global level. I mean, COVID went like wildfires in a matter of weeks. Same for H1N1 influenza back in 2009, it crossed the world in 6 weeks. So that shows the absolute importance of what we call deep prevention. So I try to reduce the risk of zoonotic spillover. And that's another blind spot, both from in my view, from a more sort of technical scientific perspective and from a international law perspective. So the importance is evident. Actually, it's surprising that it took COVID to put One Health squarely in the agenda of international lawmaking, because I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss it later. It's one of the most frequent proposals when people are talking about the future pandemic treaty or the need to reform international law to prevent a future pandemic. And so this was important because to prevent zoonotic spillover, or to put the world in a position of detect outbreaks very quickly and try to have a successful chance at containing them, we need to understand the drivers. What are the drivers? What are the transactions? What are the places that facilitate this spillover, that put, in particular, not only wildlife, but also livestock and humans in contact and facilitate this spillover? And these are mostly environmental, deforestation, climate change, loss of biodiversity, land use change, but also commercial, intensive farming that people are not talking about that much, and trade in animals, legal and illegal, but also social and economic. Think of subsistence bushmeat eating because of food insecurity. So we have a number of drivers that obviously are complex and multifaceted, but they show the importance of this challenging concept of One Health, putting different communities and different concepts together to try to, frankly, try to prevent or to detect quickly the next pandemic, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Finally, the One Health issue overlaps, at least partly, with the equally difficult problem of antimicrobial resistance. So the increasing resistance of pathogens to antimicrobials like antibodies and so on. And this is a big problem in livestock because of intensive farming, irrational use of antibiotics and so on. So there is a compounded problem that the viruses that jump from animal to humans are also resistant to antibodies. So we have a perfect storm there. So I think the importance of this for pandemic prevention is very evident, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really what's coming out of your thing is that there's so many pressures coming also from the health, from the animal health area, like now what you just mentioned with antimicrobial resistance, and certainly from the environmental area with deforestation and all these other environmental pressures, of course, climate change and so forth that we haven't even mentioned yet, which I'm sure Danielle will address later on, but that all these pressures are really creating pressures on pandemics, and then it's absolutely critical for pandemic prevention to look at all of these holistically, to actually prevent things from actually emerging in the first place. Yeah, because our current international legal frameworks essentially only kick in once a pandemic has emerged. So how do we actually create a system that actually prevents, or as you say, you call it deep prevention, that really prevents them from emerging and all? And that really requires kind of a One Health approach, looking at all these animal and environmental aspects. And with that, I'd like to actually turn to Helen. Maybe we can delve into a little bit. So we've talked about by now a little bit about what One Health is, how it's understood, why it's become kind of a topical issue in the recent 2 years because of the pandemic. But if we look at the concept of One Health, who would you say are the main actors today who are active and are pushing this forward, especially at the international level?
Thank you, Ayelet, and thank you also from my side for giving us this opportunity to stop thinking alone and to share our work and to give to share our thoughts on this important topic that is One Health. So you're asking me who are the main actors of One Health, but this is a difficult question because it depends on the definition of One Health. And to me, Pedro already answered to this question, and I agree with what he said. One Health, as I conceive it, is threefold. It is first a fact, a mere fact, but it can also become a prescriptive concept, and it should also be a method. So first, as a fact, there is no actor of One Health, because One Health is just an expression that we invented to capture and to restate something that we all knew and that our grandfathers probably knew before us, which is that our health depends on animal health and the state of the environment. So from this point of view, One Health is not due to be done, it just is. But that being said, the increases of emerging and re-emerging diseases invites us to go beyond this mere acknowledgement that there are interactions between human health, animal health, and environment. And nowadays, One Health must become a prescriptive concept which will lead to the adoption of concrete norms of behavior whose purpose is to limit the risks at the interface between humans, animals, and the environment. And from this perspective, the actors of One Health are unlimited, because these norms of behavior can be developed in multiple areas where all the drivers that Gianluca mentioned are. And these areas are agriculture, urban planning, veterinarian medicine, trade, surveillance systems, and even financing programs, because financing programs can encourage projects which are in accordance with the One Health approach. And these norms can be developed also and developed and promoted at every level, at the community level, with farmers, hunters, indigenous people, and to the global level through international organizations, through interstate cooperation, through global programs, and also in between via the subnational levels. For example, we can think about cities, the national level with the action from ministries, and the regional level with the action of regional organizations. But for these norms and standards to emerge, for One Health to become a prescriptive concept which will be relevant, we need to go through an intermediary step where One Health is conceived as a method. And this method would rely on the dialogue and on the cooperation and the collaboration between different sectors and disciplines in order to increase our knowledge at the interface of humans, animals, and the environment. And from this perspective, One Health as a method, the primary actors of One Health are the scientists and the experts in different disciplines, such as virology, epidemiology, public health, veterinarian medicine, agronomy, climate and environmental sciences, informatics, modeling, and so on. And one should not forget social scientists like anthropologists, economists, because these experts help understanding the behavioral and the economic causes of the risk that are emerging at the interface between humans, animals, and the environment. So this interdisciplinary collaboration and this inclusive dialogue is crucial to understand health issues comprehensively and ultimately to shape relevant, realistic, and socially acceptable norms of conduct that will reduce the risk and that will eventually improve human well-being. So you see, everyone can be an actor of One Health because it must be a society-wide approach, I would say.
Wow, that's almost overwhelming, I would say, because so what you're basically saying is everyone can get involved into this, because everyone has a role to play. Every human, you know, all of these sectors, be it from the international, regional, national, local, whatever, has a role to play. But currently now, you know, that's kind of, you know, a desired state that everyone's involved in this, of course. But who would you say are like the main international actors, or that are actually working on, you know, this now, or, you know, perhaps especially in the United Nations system, who are kind of the main leaders in this field that are actually trying to advance this notion of One Health? If you could talk about that, that would be really fantastic.
Yeah, about the UN system, I think One Health calls for a UN system-wide approach, where every organization, part of the system, has a role to play regarding One Health. But we are facing a difficulty here because one core principle in international institutional law is the principle of specialty. So this is a very famous principle known by every international lawyer, which means that an international organization must stick to its mandate and it cannot encroach on the responsibilities and on the mandate on another organization. And you all know the ICJ advisory opinion on the use of nuclear weapons on this. So this, of course, applies to WHO, which is responsible for human health. It applies to FAO, which is responsible for food and agriculture, and it applies to OIE, which is responsible for animal health. And specialization is efficient, but it leads to a tendency, as Pedro said, to think in silos and to overlook the interactions between the different sectors. And this is even more problematic that we are witnessing nowadays, the multiplication of cross-sectoral issues, such as development assistance, such as climate mitigation and adaptation, and such as emerging and re-emerging diseases. And these cross-sectoral issues do not fall into the responsibility of one single organization. These cross-sectoral issues challenge the very repartition of competencies between the different international organizations. So in theory, the UN Charter provides for tools to make the UN system coherent. In theory, the UN Charter provides tools like cooperation agreements, coordination of activities through an organ which is called ECOSOC. But in practice, coherence and coordination has always been difficult to achieve at the UN system. And this can partly be explained by the fact that specialized agencies have gained great independence and great autonomy, and they are not willing to give up this autonomy. And this phenomenon is aggravated by the varying cultures and the varying power relations from one agency to another. So regarding One Health specifically, I noticed two striking elements that show that coordination and coherence are difficult to achieve in the UN system. The first element is that to date, we have no comprehensive One Health program adopted by the UN, at the UN level, by the UNGA or by ECOSOC. And secondly, I would be happy to hear what Gianluca, Pedro, and Daniel think about this, but the pandemic treaty that we are talking about is being negotiated at the WHO, which is responsible for human health. And to my knowledge, there was no real discussion about a system-wide international conference which should associate the various organizations involved in One Health. So in other words, the passion for One Health that arose after the COVID-19 pandemic did not lead to a clear change of paradigm. But that being said, Ayelet, to come back to the main actors inside the UN system, there are positive outcomes because FAO, OIE, WHO have been collaborating on important aspects of One Health for more than a decade. And for us lawyers, it's interesting to note that this collaboration relies on a corpus of documents whose legal character is going stronger with time. In 2010, we started with a mere concept note, which is a floppy narrative document without any legal character. Then we moved to what we call a commitment in 2017, which is
Let's give her a tiny moment because she's going to try to log on, I'm pretty sure. Okay, you know what? So let's Danielle, if you don't mind, let's continue with you, and then when after that we can go back to Helen. These technical problems are, I guess, with us here to stay until the end of times. So Danielle, I'm so happy to have you with us here today. You're an expert on international environmental law, working a lot on climate change and other related issues. And really, I think when we look at One Health, I mean, the concept itself always talks about, you know, the animal, the health, and the environmental aspect and how they're interlinked. That being said, there is some kind of sense that the environmental part has been somewhat neglected, at least, you know, when we look at the sciences actually that have been looking at this, you know, there's a lot of focus has been on zoonotic diseases, so spillover diseases from animal to humans, and or antimicrobial resistance. And there is some kind of sense that, you know, environmental sciences haven't received as much attention. But then here, you know, we're coming to speak about it from the legal aspect. How do you see One Health from your standpoint, you know, coming from environmental law? Do you see any of it being integrated? Does it at all exist, this concept, or how do you see it, you know, coming together with these other streams of international law to create a better One Health concept going forward? So, to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Ayelet, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be sharing this stage with other very accomplished experts. And I should first start off by saying that, of course, I am not an expert on global health or One Health for that matter. What I will share now is really my reflections and observations on how the global, or rather the health agenda, has featured from the environmental law governance perspective. And as I understand it, One Health is collaborative, it's multi-sectoral, it's transdisciplinary. But what does it actually mean, and how do they actually intersect, and how do we see it playing out in the international law governance framework? Is there a gap, as been suggested in the earlier comments? Well, let's start from the science, because at least from the science basis, as you asked, as you quite rightly pointed out, there is science, law, health, environment link. And the science is quite clear about the link between global health and environment. And this is a fact that Helen spoke about earlier. But let's break it down a little bit more. The science informs us of the link between the key drivers of environmental factors and degradation, such as land use change, illicit wildlife trade, and the link between that and the downstream impacts of ill health and zoonotic disease outbreak. And from a governance perspective, it certainly has led to growing awareness among public policymakers as well as the public of the threats to public health associated with environmental factors. And also, therefore, is as a consequence, increasing attention to the health aspects of sustainable development. Another global health challenge in this regard to both animals and to humans is, of course, climate change, which is one of the many contributors to health threats and often exacerbates existing conditions. And in this regard, nations that are most vulnerable to climate change and that bear a disproportionate burden of the health impacts are also often have the least capacity to manage those impacts. So those are, again, you know, diffuse, but nonetheless, I think there are elements that go broadly in, from my perspective, to a comprehensive resolution and addressing of this One Health concept. In fact, the WHO has previously estimated that between 2030, 2050, the climate change could cause some 250,000 deaths a year. Now, that will be quite a drastic outcome, but that is the reality of what we face. Now, the recent events have also starkly demonstrated that the public health threat has become more transnational in nature. COVID, just as an example, has morphed from a health threat to a developmental as well as an economic crisis. And this reminds world leaders that the health, economic, social, and environmental disasters need to be tackled holistically. So to me, that is the key and perhaps the wedge to start looking at the legal framework, because this is where policymakers from different sectors are now going to have to deal with a threat, a multi-pronged threat. At the same time, however, and this is where international environmental law or international law as a whole comes in, because there are clear limits, practical limits to the ability of governments, no matter how efficient and how effective they are within the national borders, there is a limit to how they can contain these threats to health within their national borders. This therefore calls for a legal regime, international legal regime rather, that is able to address this complex web of transboundary issues. So in this regard, the role of international law, environmental law becomes increasingly important. So of course, I think later we'll talk about the proposed pandemic treaty. But international environmental law, in my view, it is not perfect. It certainly is not perfect. But there is a potential, and indeed, as I would propose, it is already in certain elements contributing to furthering this One Health agenda. Whether or not it actually uses the nomenclature of One Health, we can see that there are some ways in which it has operated in this way, featuring common elements such as a collaborative, multi-sectorial approach that is operating at the national, regional, and international level. So let's start at the beginning. The seeds of this approach were actually sown in 1972. The UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm actually drew attention to the issue of environmental degradation and the need for more intensified, coordinated international action. And this included an explicit recognition of the health dimension of environmental issues. Later on in the 1987 Earth Summit, in the Rio Declaration, two very important foundational treaties were adopted, and we will talk about this now very quickly in my comments, which is the UNFCCC and the Convention on Biological Diversity. These two were adopted and open for signature. And at the same time, they adopted the Declaration on Environment and Development and the Agenda 21. The principle one of the Rio Declaration actually recognizes that human beings are the center of concerns for sustainable development and entitled to a healthy and productive life with nature. So you see both elements here as well. So amidst all these, we have before us now a plethora of multilateral environmental agreements, and most of which, in fact, all of which are underpinned by health implications. Whether you're talking about Montreal Protocol on ozone protection, or the Basel Convention on Transboundary Haze, or the UNFCCC, they are all relating to the environment as well and underpinned by health. But let me now draw specifically within the time available to look at the climate change governance framework and also the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And let's see what these frameworks show us, because all of them, I think, in my view, share common features. I mean, they're science-driven, they're dynamic with the ability to adjust according to the threats and the new information. All of them do reflect this principle of equity, or at least a differentiated consideration of the developed circumstances of developing countries and unique circumstances. All of them do provide some provision for financial and technical assistance, and accompanied by accountability regime. So looking first at the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, broadly I would call that the International Climate Change Law Framework. How do they and where do they reference health? Now, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of Experts, again, the work of this science body underpins and informs the development of the legal rules. So that's critical and that's important, because we need science to accompany the policy, and then from there, the law. And the most recent sixth assessment report continues to give very grave assessments about the projected increases in global health and how this can then affect health. Increases in global temperature, and how this can affect health, safe provision of safe drinking water, secure housing, and so on. So there's direct impact on health due to, for example, heat waves and floods, but also indirect impacts due to the disturbance in complex ecological processes. And that can, again, among other things, influence and affect the distribution of vectors and infectious diseases as well. So we see that there is indeed a health paradigm in here. So turning now to the text of the agreements, why do I say that this regime, although not perfect, has the potential to address global health issues? Now, of course, it cannot do it by itself. And on that, I completely agree with what Helen has said earlier. Every actor needs to play a role. But are we optimizing the potential within each of these agreements? And that is a question. Personally, I think because it is so complex and One Health is so multifaceted, it is almost, I cannot conceive, and I am happy to be proven wrong, but I do think it's quite difficult to conceive of in a treaty, a single treaty that can encompass comprehensively all the elements needed for One Health. But I'll be very happy to hear the views of the other experts on this panel. Now, turning to the UNFCCC, Article 1 is where we first see a reference to human health, because it defines the adverse impacts of climate change as changes to the physical environment, as well as the biosphere, for example, which has significant deleterious effects on the ecosystem, as well as on human health and welfare. So in this respect, health protection is recognized as a key aspect of the climate change regime. So we already see that featuring in here. But how does it translate in practice in the mechanism and the operationalization of the climate change governance? And so in brief, for others on this who may be less familiar with the climate regime, I mean, the key features, of course, talks about commitment for parties to put in what I would simply call mitigation strategies on the one hand, which is, in other words, measures to reduce your carbon emissions, and that as one of the key considerations. But there are other key measures here relating to adaptation, which is how parties respond to climate change, because the reality is that it is already happening. Consequences are already visited upon states. And so it is quite important that states are able to adapt to the consequences of climate change as well. So the references to health, as we see in this agreement, because of the way and because of the emphasis of the UNFCCC being on the reduction of emissions, that any references to health are really more geared towards the stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions. That's one thing. So it doesn't talk about health as the primary motivation, but it's almost indirect, because you need to stabilize greenhouse gas, because that is important as well. So how has the UNFCCC tapped the potential offered by this governance framework to address the harms of climate change to human health? How has the links between climate change, especially in this adaptation regime, and global human health progressed in the course of past COP decisions? Because what we have are the framework decisions, but again, a lot of the details, a lot of the elaborations is fleshed out in COP decisions. And in the interest of time, I will not go through this, except to say that the first reference in the COP decision was actually in COP 2 in Geneva, where it declared that adverse effects of climate change on human health were potentially irreversible. But the references in subsequent COP decisions to questions of health have been, to be fair, very patchy. I mean, there have been some isolated references here referring to adaptation and monitoring for health in relation to disease and disease control, for example, but it really has been rather sketchy. In 2201, the Marrakesh Accords actually advanced the health initiatives, with parties recognizing that human health is at the center of problems deserving global attention. But again, as I said, the efforts have really been quite patchy, to the extent that in 2011, the World Health Organization stated that actually it made the comment in a report that the health is very poorly represented in the operating mechanisms for climate change conventions, including adaptation planning and finance, and within mitigation plans and the finance stream. So this is where we are. But I think things have improved since. I mean, in 2011, we saw in Durban, we saw the re-emergence of the direct central references to health. And this has continued from 2011 to today. And I just need to highlight for those who may have more time to read this in 2016, look at the Marrakesh COP22, which again reflects what I call a progressive emphasis on health, with the Ministerial Declaration on Health, Environment and Climate Change. Now, subsequently, we have now the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, I think, in the way it has operated, the way we have in various COP decisions since, it has demonstrated a far greater readiness, and I will say readiness with a big caveat, to address the link and to integrate health in international climate law. If you look at the preamble to the Paris Agreement, it acknowledges the climate change as a common concern for humankind. And it talks about, and it specifically says that the parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on a number of issues, including the rights to health. So again, here we have another possible wedge or health considerations to come into here. So this is an explicit reference. But apart from this explicit reference to health, there are various other provisions within the Paris Agreement, which I think can be read and understood in a manner that could be read consistently and holistically with the incorporation of health considerations. When we talk about sustainability, sustainable development, when the Paris Agreement talks about the role of scientific advice, when it talks about inviting institutions to collaborate with the Paris Agreement actors, they can in fact all be read consistently with that philosophy in mind. Now, of course, the adaptation, I think I just wanted to flag here that the adaptation commitments, or rather the references to adaptation, to me actually flags the importance of health and the operationalization of agreement to a greater extent than mitigation. Because when we look at the NDCs, which is the nationally determined contributions, the commitments that put forward at a ground-up level by states, there was an analysis of the parties' NDCs that was made, and about 3/4 of them actually mentioned adaptation and health in the adaptation elements of their plans. So I think if this can be put to play to a greater extent, if there's more support given to parties in terms of exploring this element, then I think there is one way, at least in terms of health, this is one possibility for a response to the effects of climate change on health. But again, of course, we're talking primarily of human health here. Before I move on, I just wanted to just touch very quickly on developments in COP26 that that I think is worth bearing in mind, which can perhaps provide further momentum for this in future COPs, in future decisions, in future discussions. What do we talk about? What do I mean here? Firstly, there were two important political declarations, one relating to reduction of methane and another relating to deforestation. So these are key.
Danielle, we'll have to, I'm sorry, if you could just keep it short. I'm sorry, because we still have some other speakers and our time is almost running out. Sure. Thank you.
Maybe we can leave that for the questions, but again, those are two elements. And of course, in COP26, there was a initiative led by the UK with various countries to try and bring health to the core and front and center, and to mainstream it, to integrate health considerations into future discussions. So we might see more of that in the year to come, leading up to Sharm el-Sheikh. I have some comments on the Convention on Biological Diversity, but perhaps I could leave that for the questions, because I think that's a very, very key element in terms of environmental law governance.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. I mean, and these are all, I mean, I'm sure we could also have even a panel on that, because we're obviously, just hearing you speak, it's quite clear that there's a lot of potential to address health also, within the existing international environmental frameworks. And we really need to start thinking about, improving those frameworks rather than just creating new ones, and kind of making the most out of them, and perhaps creating better operationalizing these instruments to a greater extent. So I think that's really an important point, to take with us in this One Health discussion, that we also have a lot of, meat to work with already in the international environmental law before we jump into a whole new treaty. But that being said, again, because we don't have, I mean, we still have time, but not that much time given all the important topics that we want to kind of cover. Gianluca, I'd like to move back to you and really, again, take this back to the whole issue of the pandemic treaty, because I think that's really one of the main questions that we have today in terms of One Health. So now we kind of already have a little bit of sense that we have international frameworks which could be used and improved on to advance One Health, as like Danielle has spoken about. But now really one of the topics is, should we be including it in a pandemic treaty? What is your take on that?
Yes, good question. So first of all, for those in the audience that have not been following events in WHO in the last in the last year, more or less, there has been a big push, starting with the European Union, but then gaining much more support to negotiate a new treaty, a new WHO treaty, on the understanding that the law we have in the books right now, starting with international health regulation, has proved ineffective to really control and respond to an event of the magnitude of the pandemic. So there has been a lot of movement in this direction, and the Health Assembly, the plenary body of WHO, has launched at the end of November negotiations on a new treaty. There is a new body open to all member states that had just met last week. It will meet again next week to organize its work, but we are moving in that direction, even with some resistance from countries like the United States that are not terribly enthusiastic about the treaty. But here we are. I think that there's a lot of movement and inertia in that direction. So in that sense, very briefly, I would like to support what both Hélène and Danielle said. First, that a pandemic treaty and One Health, I think, is a very graphic example. We'll have to touch on a broad number of issues potentially that are not necessarily within the core mandate of WHO, which is about human health. If we talk about environment, we talk about trade, we talk about animal health. So will there be a political consensus that WHO should take the lead or not? And in this sense, it's in my view, it's disappointing how the United Nations remain at the sidelines of this. Don't let's forget that the UN has been dealing, General Assembly has been dealing with health issues for quite a while, starting with HIV/AIDS and so on, antimicrobial resistance, non-communicable diseases. So there has been a movement from a political perspective of, in a way, setting the big political framework from the WHO to the UN, but not for the moment on One Health. So one wonders whether there needs to be also some kind of overarching framework that comes from the United Nations, from an organization that does not have the functional limitations of a specialized agency. So in terms of what the topics that could go into pandemic treaty, and these are proposals that have been floating around, I would mention maybe 4 or 5. The first, there is a big need for data and for analysis. There is a sheer lack of primary, fresh, raw data coming from countries, coming from local communities, and so on. A lot of policy decisions are made on the basis of modeling, of mathematical models, and that's not enough. So there is a need to produce the information on which scientific analysis is based. There is a need for, if you want, a centralized repository, something similar to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the equivalent body for biodiversity, that not only centralizes the collection of data, but provides the science side or the science policy interface. Second, there is a need to map the hotspots, again, the transaction of the places where the higher risk of zoonotic occurs. And this has to be done through surveillance, through scientific analysis, and so on. And that's a risk assessment. So where is the risk? And there is a need for risk management. So behavioral policy, commercial adaptation that reduce the risk of spillover. And this has to be done at the national level. So I guess through a system of national obligation, but with the need for international support, both in terms of assistance and cooperation with developing countries, but also in the sense of developing harmonized benchmarks. Where do we want to go? Where are we? And of producing this science interface that I was talking about. So national and international aspect. And then finally, a better management of livestock. People have been obsessing with wildlife, but what about livestock? As I said before, they're also, to me, a prime candidate for zoonotic spillover, and that's largely unregulated. Intensive farming, use of antibiotics, avoiding the mix of species where you have chicken and pigs and lambs and cows all together that sort of share viruses and pathogens with each other. And then finally, And that's a topic that I've seen less, but there is quite some movement from, in particular from environmental association, a better regulation of trade in animals, both in wildlife species. So we have the CITES here, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, but also the WTO agreements. That to a certain extent regulate this, because the risk obviously is multiplied if the species that present a high risk of zoonotic spillover are traded around the world. So these are some of the issues that logically, at least, could go into a treaty, whether it is WHO, whether there is a change of route later on. But to me are some of the main ingredients of an international framework to regulate this.
And in terms of One Health, there's also been discussions about having this kind of as an overall concept. Is that something that you support?
To me, again, I think Pedro, Hélène, Daniele said very clearly, we suffer from the fragmentation and silos that we live in national governments. Governments act in silos. So what happens at the international level, in a way, is a trickle up of the way national governance is organized. So the idea of coordination, the idea of really operationalizing these interfaces is a challenge at all levels. And so that will be definitely one of the things that will have to happen. And one of the challenges for me will be how to bring, if One Health is included in a future pandemic treaty, how to bring into, under the roof of a treaty, this interinstitutional cooperation. How do you bring in FAO, WHO, OIE? These are separate international organizations with their own treaties, with their own membership, with their own mandate, with their own epistemic community behind. Will they be all happy to be somehow coordinated by WHO? I worked 30 years in the United Nations system, and if there is something that is the ultimate challenge, nobody wants to be coordinated. So you're able to coordinate if you have money and if you have power, in particular if you have money. And so that to me would be one of the big operational challenges. And that's where I think that the United Nations could make a difference. Because the UN, again, has taken the lead on a number of health issues. For example, no communicable diseases, something very different. But it has adopted a big declaration at the level of heads of states and government, and there are follow-up declarations that brings it all together. It's health, it's trade, it's intellectual property, it's agriculture, and so on. So somehow overtakes the fragmentation, gives at least a big policy framework where the various actors come together. Another example is disaster, the Sendai framework. That's something that has been launched by the General Assembly. I think we need something of this for One Health and other aspects of pandemic prevention, because it grossly transcends health. So that to me is a part of the picture that at this time has not really been explored. Maybe at the level of think tanks, but not in the policy discourse that I'm aware of.
And in terms of implementation, would you then envisage something that is more kind of at a framework level and then more implementation at the local level, you know, given the difficulties that you also just talked about these gaps, you know, between the international and the local levels? Is that how would you kind of, have you had any thoughts on that, on how that would be legally, you know, structured, this kind of treaty?
There are obviously many possibilities and so on.
Yeah.
But if you look at, I mean, it's a reality that the zoonotic risk are different around the world. It's not one size fits all. Again, right. SARS and COVID and so on have probably come from these largely unregulated wet markets in Asia. So that's a very Asian problem, it seems to be. Intensive farming is the problem in the United States, in Indonesia, in Argentina, in Brazil, maybe in New Zealand. In Africa, it's more bushmeat consumption for food insecurity. So I think at the implementation level, I would see something like the Paris Agreement. So states should determine in accordance with their own situations and very much bottom up with the buy-in of local communities, not sure criminalizing the consumption of bushmeat, because sometimes people don't have any alternative to starving. So you need something that includes community, indigenous people that are the custodian of biodiversity very often. And so here I think the Paris Agreement has offered some examples of nationally determined targets and so on, but with an element of international coordination, coming together every so many years to see where we are, ratcheting up, giving me the sense of ambition, offering a common framework, again, for the production of science, but also for assistance. And then regulating trade. CITES is not enough. CITES is about conservation and trade. It looks only at the transactional aspect. What happened before an animal is exported? What happened after an animal is imported? That's not covered, but that's where the health risk comes. And so that to me could be a good addition to a pandemic treaty or to an amendment to CITES later on and so on. And finally, you need money. These things are not cheap. And so there is a need for a financing mechanism that is one of the main topics in the general discourse about pandemic prevention, in particular to build up national capacities, whether it's generated nationally, whether there is a treaty-based mechanism, whether there is the equivalent of the Global Environmental Facility for pandemics. There are many possible models and proposals floating around. But the implementation will have to be in good part bottom-up with a strong national commitment, equally strong international dimension of harmonization, assistance, financing, and production of science.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I want to move back to Helen. I actually want to kind of combine a question between Helen and Pedro, because Helen wanted to speak about one of the main actors at the international level today, the One Health High Level Panel, if I'm not mistaken. That's what you wanted to mention, Helen. And then perhaps, Pedro, you wanted perhaps to, given now that we're kind of thinking about reforming the system, especially in the context of, so we know it's fragmented as it is right now, and now we have these discussions about a pandemic treaty. Do we need a new organization that would kind of coordinate all of this, that would orchestrate? Should we have like kind of a One Health body, or would it be within the WHO, under the UN, or an entirely kind of new body? So perhaps, Helen, if we could start with you, if you could talk about the existing models that we have, and then Pedro, if you could talk about what your thoughts are, if we need some kind of new institutions to coordinate the global One Health concert.
Yeah,
Helen,
thank you, Ayelet. I hope you can hear me. I don't dare opening my camera because I'm on my phone now. Sorry for this. I was about to talk about the HOLEP when I froze and when I disappeared. This is a brand new initiative that is due to the cooperation of FAO, OIE, the WHO, and also UNEP for the first time. UNEP has been associated to this cooperation. So HOLEP in long term means the One Health High Level Expert Panel, HOLEP. So this panel is absolutely not a new organization. I leave it for Pedro. HOLEP is composed of scientists from different disciplines, and it is charged by the four entities that created it to develop knowledge and provide guidance and advice to support cooperation among international organizations and governments. And we had a chance to get the notes for the record that are issued after each meeting of HOLEP, so we can follow a little bit what is going on there. And to me, HOLEP is working in an efficient and productive way. And its first accomplishment has been the adoption of what is called an operational definition of One Health. You see, operational means that it will be used to do things. And the purpose of this definition is to provide a method and a goal for One Health. So actually, this definition is not very much, does not very much guide it. It is a fair definition. It is a fair, but it is a traditional definition. There is nothing really new. I would say it's not implying any legal obligations, but still it's a first step. But despite this important step forward, I think I noticed that the collaboration between FAO, OIE, WHO, and UNEP still faces some resistance. And I would like to share with you some elements. Maybe I'm too skeptical, I don't know, you will tell me. The first element that I've noticed is that regarding the definition of One Health, which was adopted by Ayelet, the 4 organizations ambiguously declared in a December 2021 statement that they will work, I quote, in line with the spirit of this new definition. And you see this reference to the mere spirit of what is supposed to be an operational definition might testify of a tendency from the 4 entities to secure a margin of freedom regarding this new definition. And another thing I find a bit ambiguous is that many times FAO, OIE, WHO, and UNEP are presented as tripartite and UNEP. So you see, UNEP is left aside. So this can be formally explained by the historical alliance between FAO, OIE, and WHO. UNEP is new in this cooperation. And this also can be explained by the specific administrative status of UNEP, which is not an organization, it's merely a program. But if we go beyond the formalistic approach, this way of separating UNEP from the 3 others suggests that the association of the environmental program is less integrated than what a genuine One Health approach would probably suggest. So I mean, this must be followed. I'm not sure I'm right when I'm being skeptical like this. The future will tell. But to conclude on a more optimistic note, I would like to underline that FAO, OIE, WHO, and UNEP are currently working on a global plan of action on One Health. And the final version of this global plan will be presented this month in March 2022. And I'm very curious about how the 4 entities will overcome their specialization and their autonomy in order to work together to serve One Health in all its dimensions. And I would like now to give the floor to Pedro about a new organization, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, thank you, Ayelet and Hélène. And I fully agree with Hélène on first her assessment of how the ongoing work by the One Health high-level expert panel is being conducted. So it's definitely not a new organization or institution, but rather a coordinative effort between different existing international organizations. She mentioned the 4 participating ones. And so in my view, going back to Ayelet's question and referring to Gianluca's point on the inevitable nature of the international organizations being protective of their mandate, and because evidently they have built their own expertise and their own epistemic and communities, and of course whenever another actor comes in and tries to tell them what to do and how, they would obviously they are likely to react in a very zealous manner regarding their own mandate. And this is understandable, right? Because there is at the international level often, unfortunately, a competition for resources, existing resources. And, of course, every organization wants to have more resources for their own mandates. And this, to me, is a problem that is trying to be addressed through more comprehensive collaborations like the One Health high-level expert panel. And so in that regard, while I could envisage, of course, we can think of what a new organization could look like that would tackle single-handedly all of these challenges from an operational perspective, it would be difficult to think of a new organization that could somehow borrow, quote unquote, from the existing mandate of other organizations. And to that extent, to me, and ultimately, you know, these are the activities or the actions by all of these organizations, individual activities are the ones contributing to addressing pandemic risk. So this to me is the challenge. So I could indeed think of whether a new organization could be created, but I do not envisage what type of mandate it would have. That, as I mentioned, would not lead to an overlap or even you know, mission creep eventually, where its own functions would could be made in harmony with those of other organizations, considering how, for instance, in the case of organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, it's already, I mean, health is such a comprehensive field in terms of the many determinants of health that, you know, it's challenging to devise a new mandate that can somehow tiptoe along the lines and not to, you know, step on the toes of the existing mandates on global health in the case of the World Health Organization, and so on with regards to other fields. And we heard from Jerry as well, the major issue of climate change, for example, which is another comprehensive problem needing multi-dimensional solutions. And One Health is indeed, I will just conclude with this, One Health could nevertheless set this scene and be a stepping stone towards tackling issues other than zoonotic risk. Currently, of course, because of the pandemic, zoonotic risk, and that's how the concept first emerged, to try to bridge this divide between species and the environment. But with other challenges, we will require also to look beyond the existing silos. And whether that will take the form of a new international organization with a proper legal mandate, I struggle to see. Nevertheless, the fact remains, you know, at the conceptual level, for sure, we cannot look at these problems in isolated fashion from each other. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think what we'll do now, we have about 15 minutes left. I'd like to go to the questions and answers, try to answer those, and then if the panelists would like to respond after that to things your fellow panelists have said, then we'll give an opportunity to that, time permitting. So let me start with the first question. Who says, I do feel understanding the pathophysiology and transmission dynamics of diseases remains the foremost with fragile health systems, creates the nidus of disease transmission. Transmission of diseases from animal to man in medical terminology, also known as zoonotic transmission. I'm not exactly sure. Have you understood what that question is?
It sounds like a comment more than a question.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if he wants to understand the transmission dynamics. Okay, I think the point is really saying, if I understand correctly, that the whole issue of the transmission of diseases, maybe zoonotic diseases, especially within fragile health systems. Yeah, I guess it's more of a comment. Yes, I mean, if I understand correctly, the comment here is about zoonotic transmission, and that it's especially fragile problematic in fragile health systems. Would any of you want to react to that or agree to that?
Yeah, one expert we interviewed for our white paper exercise explained us that one of the priority is to reinforce local access to healthcare, because if one person gets sick, you know, in a very remoted area, and then has to take a crowded bus to go to the city to look for care, and then it will transmit the disease to other people and so on. So that the point was to insist precisely on what you're reading, Ayelet.
Yeah, I agree. So especially, yeah, I think it's probably related to the whole idea of, health systems, which I think is also part, which is debated within the One Health concept of, building stronger health systems, especially in developing countries, because indeed that's kind of, where transmission can happen even faster. Anyone else would like to respond to this issue?
Well, I think all of us probably. So the question of health system is central, because if COVID again has shown something, it's that there is no amount of international instruments and so on that can save us from ourselves if we don't have resilient, sustainable, inclusive, and equitable health systems. And that has to do both with the prevention side, and here comes again the interface between human and animal health, and with the detection side, so to be able to stop quickly before something spreads into a pandemic. And it's something that COVID has shown, in my view, is that the problem of health system is not just a problem of development. It's not that poor countries cannot make it and rich countries can make it. I'm Italian, and I think we have a very decent public health system, but it imploded in a matter of weeks during COVID, in particular in the very industrialized, very developed part of the country in the north. So one lesson of COVID is that it's not just a matter of development, it's a matter of the model of public health and healthcare, where it is very privatized. There is a credible network of primary healthcare professionals. That's what Ayelet was saying. A person should not have to take a crowded bus to go from the village to the city to receive the first care. The first care should be at the village level, so that person doesn't have to travel. That's primary health care. It's part of the dogmas of WHO for the last 50 years. And that is something that shows again its importance from a prevention point of view, just from a public health protection point of view. So that's central, and that cuts across all the aspects of pandemic preparedness and response that we've been talking about for the last 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Pedro, Danielle, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, well, just briefly following up on both Ayelet and Gianluca, and Ayelet was referring, if I understand the question correctly, on the need to understand the pathophysiology of transmission. Well, as Ayelet referred to, we currently, these zoonotic spillover events, like the one that quite possibly led to COVID-19, are not the only zoonotic events we have been witnessing in the last decades. There are many of them, and not all of them, fortunately for all of us, lead to a pandemic like the one we are currently living. But the many types of interactions between human and non-human animals and the environment, and and the many risk activities that may enhance risk, they're so widespread that it would be difficult to think to eliminate risk altogether because of the way in which these transmission dynamics occur. But of course, we can nevertheless think of identifying those quote unquote risk maximizers. So those activities that really exponentially increase the probability that a zoonotic spillover will occur. And moreover, that this spillover can turn into a pandemic. And I will only refer to past decades where there were constant zoonotic events of avian influenza in Asia, for example, either in Hong Kong and in mainland China, for instance. And this was already on the radar. So it's just that in past instances, we had the luck that it didn't turn out to be like the current coronavirus pandemic. But this is certainly not the first time we have been witnessing these zoonotic events, posing a risk. And I'll leave it now to Danielle in case she wants to add something.
No, thank you. I won't be adding this question.
But we have here a question to Danielle, so I think maybe you could address this one. She's asking, I want to hear from Danielle on how the Convention on Biological Diversity can help with the One Health initiative, including other ways environmental regimes can support the initiative. In terms of legal obligations, what could the panel suggest as, I want to say the planet, what could the panel suggest as potential applicable legal principles for the One Health initiative? Please, Danielle.
Thank you very much, Ayelet, for the question, and thank you to the participant for the question. So indeed, I think on the Convention on Biological Diversity, thank you for raising that, because that is another key convention where the drivers and the link between biodiversity loss and human and animal health is quite clear from the science. But the law, the question is, how has the law caught up with it? And in this aspect, it is quite interesting that despite the rather limited references within the convention, as the CBD convention text itself, there is a decision 1221 on health and biodiversity specifically in the context of the CBD convention. And it specifically, I highlighted it because the decision actually recognizes the value of One Health approach. So this is one of the few places where I actually see this clear direct reference to One Health approach in an international environmental instrument, which recognizes the value of the One Health approach to address the cross-cutting issues of biological diversity and human health as an integrated approach consistent with the ecosystem approach that integrates actually the complex relationships between humans, microorganisms, animals, plants, agriculture, wildlife, and environment. So it's very wide-ranging, and this is it struck me because it was indeed one of the few places that actually saw such a direct reference to this term One Health, and it's supported by a specific guidance produced within the context of this convention. It is a guidance on integrating biodiversity considerations into One Health approaches. So this is a CBT Substar document released in December 2017. A whole list of guidance there for parties to look at in approaching this question. So I thought that was quite an interesting issue to raise, because it could be an example of how environmental treaties could in a way support, not take over, but support this agenda. Yeah.
There was a second question, in terms of legal obligations, what could the panel suggest as potential applicable legal principles for One Health initiative? Who would like to take that? Helen, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah,
Helen, would you like to reply?
Thank you for this very important question. I think with regard to principles that we should have in a One Health perspective, we could really much benefit from the existing environmental law principles, which are developed, like the prevention principle and the precaution principle. These two principles could be extended to the global One Health approach. And another thing that could inspire the One Health approach from the environmental law perspective is the risk assessments. I think we should develop risk assessment as encompassing an overall One Health approach, meaning that when someone wants to engage into a certain activity, this person has to realize to make a risk assessment, and this risk assessment should take into consideration the One Health approach.
Anyone else?
I would like to support what Ayelet said. I think there's a lot to draw from environmental law and the practice that we have built since the 70s, not only for One Health, but more broadly for health security. Because to me, some of the concepts, some of the principles are really clearly relevant directly to the problems of, in particular, protection from epidemics and pandemics. In terms of the let's call it operational principle that could underpin a pandemic treaty, going back to what I was saying before, I would add maybe equity, because you don't, you cannot have a successful model unless you take into account the needs of the communities that live with this problem. It's a bottom-up approach, science, but again, science policy interface. We cannot blindly abdicate to science. Science has to be translated into proper risk assessment, as Ayelet said, and risk management. And finally, so the idea of joint risk management, these in a way interface between what has to happen at the national level and what has to happen supportively at the international level, whether it's through a new treaty governance mechanism, whether it's through a better coordination of existing international organizations and so on. But these two aspects have, and again, that's a lesson from environmental law. So really we can draw a lot from the lessons of environmental law and practice.
Oh, I think we have one. Okay, we have one more question, two more questions. Okay, that one wasn't so relevant. Okay, maybe one more question and then just the closing remarks. What have been the lessons of the coronavirus pandemic for the international regulation of therapeutic goods? Does there need to be greater collaboration among national regulators and between national regulators and the WHO? I don't know that this is necessarily a One Health related question. It's more about, I guess, access to vaccines and medicines. But perhaps Gianluca, if you want to say a word about that.
Well, how many hours do I have? Yeah, that's a
Maybe
central
just,
question.
Yeah.
But it's not so One Health specific. I mean, again, COVID has shown how dysfunctional the current model is at times of crisis. And in a way, that question can be applied also to the use of antimicrobials, for example. As you know, part of the AMR discourse is the fact that the antibiotics that we have on the shelves are more and more ineffective. And so there is a need for this research and development and investment in new antimicrobials. But this is not happening because there's not much prospect of profit for the industry. And this will be very important if the One Health and antimicrobial resistance issues start really overlapping, where we have a pattern of drug-resistant microbes that come from animals into humans. So in that sense, obviously, you need a bit of a Copernican revolution, and you need it now. You need the times of peace, not when we have a crisis. A better system of technology transfer, of coordination of research and development. The WHO has shown what can happen at times of crisis. It's really been a very successful coordinator of primary research and clinical trials. And a different system to think about financing of research and development and allocation of vaccines, countermeasure, diagnostics, and so on. So that's a much bigger discourse, but definitely relevant also in a One Health and antimicrobial resistance perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. We're really nearing the end of our panel, and I think I just wanted to say some concluding remarks. I mean, listening to all of you, this has been a fascinating discussion, and of course, One Health is such a in the works. So I think this is going to be a discussion that will continue in the years to come. I think what's quite clear at this stage that it's a very broad topic, and it's a concept that really touches on so many different sciences and sectors and institutions and actors. So horizontally, it's really widely spread, but also vertically, if we think about how to work, develop rules, implement them. I mean, they're at the international, at the regional, at the national. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time to talk about what's happening at the national and regional level, but that's certainly, there are initiatives there, and certainly at the implementation level, as Gianluca and others have mentioned. I mean, that's where really it comes down to, like, how do we get surveillance and all this other implementation done. So we also have really this very deep vertical level, and it's true across many countries across the world. And I think also within each sector, we're kind of asking ourselves, do the instruments we have, are they enough? Should they just be adapted, like the CITES agreement or the Paris Agreement? Can we just adapt these agreements to make them better, to adapt for health? Or do we really need new kinds of treaties, new kinds of agreements? So I think there are really a lot of questions and issues out there which really make this issue of One Health, which I think on the one hand, we can all agree is really a critical term if we want to prevent a future pandemic, a major collective action problem. And in that sense, maybe I want to join what some of you have said. We need to look at other big collective action problems at the international level, like climate change, and try to learn from their lessons what went well and what's not went so well, if we really want to move this topic forward. So that's kind of my take. No big solutions at this stage, but at least we're hopefully heading someplace. So I really want to take this opportunity to thank again our fantastic panelists, and of course everyone at CIL behind the scenes who make this possible, Jerry Neg and Matthew Yo and Shiris Chong. So thank you very, very much. For those that haven't been able to attend, of course, this recording will be made available on the CIL website and also on the CIL YouTube, so many more can enjoy our discussion about One Health and international law. So that's it from here. Thank you very much.